Chapter 1, Lies and Ambition. Gravesend, the 1st of January 1786. It was dark when James Sinclair left the Anchor Inn and headed for the docks. As he walked across the cobbles towards the Cherwell, the bitter easterly wind flecked his coat with icy grains of snow. Moonlight broke intermittently through the clouds, illuminating the mighty ship standing before him. He paused at the foot of the gangplank and looked up. Yellow lantern lights dotted through the rigging punctured the blackness of the winter night, and the sails were reefed tight against the restless blustery squalls. His stomach tightened. He was glad to be on his way. He was sick of England, sick of money and connections being the chief means of advancement, and sick of never having enough of either. He had spent his last day in England writing letters. One was to his sister Morag in Edinburgh, sending her a forwarding address in London. One was to his lawyer Henry Bowman in Cheapside, which he sent with a signed copy of his last will and testament, and one was to Iona McNeill, the woman he loved, telling her that he did not intend to return to Scotland, which was true, and indicating that she meant nothing to him, which was a lie. With these letters dispatched, and feeling confident that his affairs were in order, he pulled down his hat and boarded the Cherwell, a 758-ton East Indiaman bound for Madras. Preparation for this journey had started earlier in the year when he attended a selection process at the London headquarters of the East India Company. It was a building he had passed many times, a neoclassical masterpiece, the mercantile heart of the City of London and the centre of the greatest enterprise on earth. Its wealth flowed through the banks and merchant houses of the city like the water of the Thames, washing them with silt of pure shining gold and, in the opinion of men of principle, corrupting everything it touched. Although Sinclair was aware of the company's less than wholesome reputation, he knew that for men of ability like him it was still the goose that laid the plumpest and the most golden of eggs, and he, despite his political misgivings and the pricks from his Presbyterian conscience, was very much hoping to find himself in possession of one soon. With 5 other hopefuls, he underwent 2 examinations. The first tested his knowledge of anatomy, physic, surgery and midwifery, the second his knowledge of botany, chemistry, materia medica and the creation of healing medicines and remedies. Then he was interviewed in the director's court, a room so vast in scale and decoration that if he had not been well prepared he might have been overwhelmed. As far as Sinclair was concerned, the questions were mundane and easily answered. When the old man had asked him why he had applied for the position, he had replied that he wanted to seek out new treatments for tropical diseases using the flora of the subcontinent. He knew the answer he gave so precisely chimed with the political requirements of the company, and it was no surprise to him when a few weeks later he heard that the post was his. At the end of November, he was called to Leadenhall Street to complete the formalities and to be briefed on the company's new Indian medical service. There he was greeted by a keen, fresh-faced officer called Lovell, who looked no more than 18 and was dressed in a uniform straight out of Hawks. With a smile as bright as his brand-new epaulettes, the young man said, "You will start your journey to India at the end of the year." Sinclair thought the boy's mother must be proud of her son's new position, and was sad that his father would not feel the same about his. "That's the middle of winter," he replied, unsure about starting a journey when the sea was at its most treacherous. "Yes, sir," the young man beamed. "It's to catch the winds from the Cape in the spring. It's the quickest way to India." I see," Sinclair mused, trying to disguise his unease. Sensing the doctor's reluctance, the young man set about reassuring him. "I can see you're not completely comfortable with the idea, sir. Your ship is the newly refitted Cherwell, one of the company's largest, under the captaincy of Mr. Richards. Captain Richards is one of our most experienced men. He has already sailed the Cherwell to Madras and China on several occasions, all without incident." Sinclair nodded, accepting the young man's reassurance and allowing him to continue with the rest of his well-rehearsed lines. "Your journey will start at Gravesend, and take you to Madeira, Goree and the Cape of Good Hope. From there you'll sail across the Indian Ocean, landing in Madras at the end of March. Then a local ship will take you to Calcutta." "Aye. That's more or less what I expected." Lovell handed him a contract. Uninterested in the details, Sinclair scanned the contents, took a deep breath and wrote his name on the paper. He had learned his trade from the very best surgeons and anatomists in the world, and now he was ready to take advantage of his investment. Standing on the great ship, he felt his old and unhappy life was behind him, and the weight of years of disappointment and his father's disapproval seemed to lift from his shoulders. "You'll find your accommodation on the lower deck, sir," said the boatswain. "You're with the ship's senior officers, Lieutenants Merrick and Alsop, the ship's surgeon, Mr. Hodge, and a Captain Greenwood of the Bengal Army." "Aye, thank you," Sinclair said, raising his hat to the short burly man and feeling the icy fingers of the wind running through his thick, sandy hair. Sinclair thanked the man again, and descended into the quiet golden belly of the ship. When he had imagined himself on board, he had pictured himself in a cozy wooden cabin with a glass window and a comfortable cot. His cabin, when he found it, was a makeshift affair, constructed from canvas sheets stretched and nailed onto rough, wooden frames. Where the window should have been there was a leaky wooden hatch covering an unglazed porthole. It was battened shut, but the freezing wind was wheedling its way in with an icy chill. He slumped into his armchair, feeling the fizz of his enthusiasm disappear. He had not expected to travel in luxury, but could not help registering the difference between his accommodation on the ship and the luxuries of the company offices in Leadenhall Street. Above, he could hear the giggles and shrieks of excited young girls, and he started to wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. Knowing there was no going back, he made himself comfortable. He lit his lamp, took out a battered copy of Candide, his favorite book, and checked the hour with his treasured pocket watch. Like the book, it was French, and the most beautiful thing he had ever owned. He cradled it in his palm. The warmth of its golden body reminded him of the smoothness of a woman's skin. Its pearly white face was elegantly marked with Roman numerals, and the back, the part that he loved most of all, was made of cobalt blue enamel and shimmered like the silk of Iona McNeil's ball gown the night they had danced at the Edinburgh Assembly Rooms. He turned it in his hand and kissed it, then he put it back in his waistcoat pocket and started to read. He chose the scene where Candide, the hero of the story, and his professor friend, Dr. Pangloss, are nearly drowned in Lisbon Harbour along with a sailor called Jacques. Candide and Pangloss survive, but Jacques dies attempting to save a fellow sailor. To explain how this is all part of God's harmonious plan, Pangloss says that Lisbon Harbour was created specifically so that Jacques could drown there and fulfill God's divine plan for him. This was an idea so preposterous, like so many in the book, that it made Sinclair laugh out loud. At 8, he joined the other passengers in the ship's saloon. It was a simple, lime-washed room with a low ceiling and skylights onto the quarterdeck. In the center, there was a long refectory table with space for 16 people to dine comfortably. Sinclair pushed his way into the throng milling around in the space between the table and the low wall-mounted lockers that doubled as seats when the room was used for recreation. Captain Richards greeted him with a firm handshake. He was a man Scots would describe as braw, and was in his late 40s by Sinclair's reckoning. "May I offer you a glass of Madeira, Dr. Sinclair?" "Aye, thank you," the doctor replied with a nod, acknowledging the equality of their ranks. "Between you and our surgeon Mr. Hodge we shall be in good hands on this voyage," Richards said. "I pray my interventions will not be needed, Captain," Sinclair replied, making the older man smile. "Experience tells me that on voyages like this anything can happen, Dr. Sinclair. In which case, I am at your disposal." The captain put his hand on Sinclair's shoulder. "I'm glad to hear it, sir." Then he pushed past him, to speak to the scarlet-coated army captain. One of the ship's officers approached, introducing himself as Lieutenant Merrick. He explained that their purpose was to resupply Fort St. George in Madras with fresh soldiers, their numbers having been much depleted during the last war. The lieutenant assured Sinclair that the men of the lower orders were to be confined to the ship's hold, but their captain, Mr. Greenwood, would join the passengers and fellow officers for meals and recreation. Merrick rested his hand on his sword. "You won't be short of work in Madras, Dr. Sinclair. It's a regular bloodbath. If it's not the natives, it's the bloody French. My cousin was with Colonel Kelly in '83, thousands dead or wounded, supplies of everything scarce. It's a miracle he survived. Who knows how long Prime Minister Pitt's peace with France will last, or what this newfangled India Act will turn up." "Indeed," replied Sinclair, "but I'm bound for Calcutta and the company's hospital there." And with that Merrick was gone, leaving Mr. Hodge, the barrel-chested ship's surgeon, to introduce himself. Sinclair could see immediately that Hodge had an eye for the ladies.
Lovely, aren't they? The ship's surgeon said, looking at the captain with his daughters and stroking the plume of thick, grey hair that crescendoed to a single curl on top of his head.
Completely mercenary though, all of them, he continued, casting his lecherous eye around the room.
All they want is a rich husband,
so watch yourself, laddie.
I will thank you, but I'm not rich,
so I'm in very little danger, replied Sinclair, taking another glass of Madeira.
Well, there's nothing to say you can't try your luck.
It's a long journey, but take my advice, if you're not sincere in your intentions, stay away from the captain's daughters.
I'd hate to see you keelhauled.
Oh aye,
very funny, Mr. Hodge.
Trust me, I'm no imbecile, said Sinclair.
I'm sure you're not, laddie,
the surgeon laughed loudly, shaking his vast barrel of a chest. I've got my eye on that filly over there. He pointed at a woman with dark hair. She's a recent widow, by all accounts. I shall enjoy offering her a bit of comfort. Hodge licked his lips with bawdy anticipation. Remember, I saw her first, he smirked, and headed off in her direction. As they sat down to eat, Sinclair found himself next to Miss Morris, the captain's niece. His eyes were immediately drawn to her handsome bosom. He could see that Captain Greenwood, across the table, had noticed her too. She smiled at him, then pulled her shawl around her shoulders, obscuring his view. What are your plans when you get to India, Dr. Sinclair? She inquired without any of the usual formalities, a social transgression that unsettled him immediately. He looked at her, and felt the painful awkwardness he had felt all his adult life when encountering attractive women. Good evening, madam, he replied, smoothing his napkin with fake assurance. That remains to be seen, doesn't it? She flirted, doing the same. Indeed it does. Let us hope that neither of us is disappointed, he quipped in return. To answer your question, madam, I shall work with the Surgeon General of the company's new Indian Medical Service. I'll be responsible for the organization of the medical care for the company's thousands of military and civilian servants on the subcontinent. You're Scottish, Dr. Sinclair. I've never met anyone from Scotland before. Pray tell me, sir, what is Scotland like? Taken aback by her complete indifference to his position in the company, he replied, well, that's a very difficult question because it's a country of many parts, most of which I have never visited. She directed her gaze at him. I am willing to be satisfied with the parts you know, Dr. Sinclair. Madame. He paused to quell his consternation. How dare she show no appreciation of his rank, or his intellectual prowess? How dare she make him feel so uncomfortable with her beautiful breasts? He hated her already, and he had only just met her. Well, he said, I hail from Stirling myself. Now, what can I tell you about Stirling? It's a place with a big stone castle that has a little grey town attached to it. Miss Morris sipped her Madeira and cast her eyes across the table to the scarlet-coated Captain Greenwood. So, you didn't like living there, Dr. Sinclair? She smiled, but not at him. Sinclair looked at Greenwood, who was returning his dining companion's interest, and replied with rising pique. Stirling was not my favorite abode. Unperturbed, or perhaps encouraged by her companion's mounting discomfort, she continued, I'm sure Stirling has something to recommend it, Dr. Sinclair. He thought for a moment, then replied, unfortunately, I missed its most exciting episode. What was that? She said, taking one of the tureens and carefully dishing a portion of steaming hot broth into his bowl as if she were his servant. Well, he declared with increasing irritation, it was when that young scallywag Bonnie Prince Charlie tried to take the place. Oh, it's not good to make light of enemies of the crown, Dr. Sinclair, she smiled, picking up her spoon. It was a jest, madam. I assure you I'm loyal to the crown. I have no time for the Bonnie Prince and his Highland thugs. I am Scottish and I am British, my allegiance is to the king. If I may return to your question, the place I was happiest was Leiden. I studied at the university there. It's a beautiful town with elegant buildings and a multitude of canals that freeze in the winter, when there is great entertainment to be had in skating. Hoping he had satisfied her curiosity, he started on his soup. As he ate, he saw the dashing Captain Greenwood calmly watching him from the corner of his eye. Why couldn't he be more like him, he thought. Why did he always end up making a fool of himself as soon as he saw a pretty face? With the first course finished, Sinclair took another glass of wine.
I'd like to know more about Scotland, sir. It sounds a fascinating place, his torturer purred by his side. He braced himself again. Indeed it is. My father is a minister of the kirk there. How interesting. My own dear father is dead, but when he was with us he was not of a religious persuasion. Neither am I, Sinclair replied with some relief, but then could not resist boasting. My father is a very popular preacher in Edinburgh. Her shawl slipped from her shoulders, allowing him a view of her breasts again. He has a very successful formula for filling his pews on Sundays, he continued, distracted by the frisson of excitement in his groin. Pray tell me, sir, what is that? Whatever the subject of his sermon he always ends it on the perils of licentiousness, madam. As the words left his mouth, his heart began to sink. Licentiousness is a very dangerous thing, Dr. Sinclair, his companion smiled, turning his cheeks scarlet. I am firmly of the opinion that men do not regulate their actions by anything the church has to say. In my experience a man's conscience is entirely determined by his class. He was astounded by the turn the conversation had taken. Indeed, I believe that is an interesting and true observation, madam. For my part I have only ever known Deptford, she continued, so I am in no position to contradict your opinion of Scotland or your father. But I suspect you are mocking a man who cares passionately about the welfare of his congregation. Indeed he does, madam, but unlike my father my passion does not necessitate abhorring human nature and making people unhappy. How interesting, Dr. Sinclair. Pray, what is your passion? With great relief he proclaimed, medicine, Miss Morris, the curing of the sick. At the first opportunity, Sinclair left the saloon for the rudimentary privacy of his canvas cabin. He was frustrated with himself. The evening that had started with so much promise had ended with him feeling deflated and humiliated. To console himself he smoked a pipe. As he sucked in the mellow tobacco he listened to the chatter of the other passengers making their way to bed. The rocking motion of the ship was vaguely soporific, but he could not settle, his mind was still in a state of agitation. He covered himself with his greatcoat and closed his eyes. Usually on New Year's Day he would have no problem sleeping. He would still be drunk from the celebration the night before. Indeed, after dancing with Iona at the assembly rooms the previous year he had immersed himself in the demon for 2 days to assuage the feelings of desire she had aroused in him. Drinking to excess was a habit he had acquired as a student. It was a habit his father and sister abhorred and one that had got him into trouble with his professors. But despite their disapproval, he often found himself craving the temporary oblivion that only its overindulgence could supply. However, he thought tonight was not one of those occasions, and his mind turned to Iona again, wondering whom she had danced with and if by some chance she was lying in her bed thinking about him. Despite their obvious delight in each other's company, he knew Iona was out of his reach. Her father was Britain's foremost medical educator, the son of the founder of Edinburgh's medical school, a man of the kirk like his father and of the university's governing body, a man with a reputation to foster and protect. His only daughter would marry a man of his choosing, a man whose work would advance the reputation of the great MacNeil dynasty, not a man like James Sinclair, a man MacNeil considered a godless, lazy drunk. Then he thought about his encounter with Miss Morris. He was glad she was not interested in him, as it would save him the embarrassment of rejecting her. He concluded they were alike in many ways. They were clever, poor and gauche. She lacked the education and manners to make a good match in polite society, while he lacked the position and reputation to marry the woman of his choice. They were both unwilling to accept what fate had assigned them. Like him, she was taking the journey hoping for fortune and success, and he had to admire her for that.